Okay, Hashem Na'aseh v'Natzliach. Hashem, tonight we're continuing study of Hilchot Shabbat. Tonight we're going to finish up talking about the halachot of Chazarah, which is returning food to the fire. Obviously, like we mentioned last time that we learned, can't put it on an open fire. Also, I would like to go through the halachot of Hatmanah, which means insulation, on Shabbat as well. Be'ezrat Hashem, learning tonight for the Refuah Shlema of Yisrael Rachamim Mordechai ben Evelyn, Shmuel Moshe ben Penina, Yaakov Yisrael Abba ben Chana Esther Helen, Aviva Tzipor bat Yibker, Rabbi Baruch ben Sivya. Any other names if you have? Yeah. Yedidia bat Nechama, Sharon. Okay.
Nasrin bat Zarian.
Nasrin bat Zarian. Moshe ben Chana.
Kurosh Yaakov Chai ben
Tova. Okay. Hashem should send them all if watch them up. Amen. Okay. All right. So we learned the concept of Chazarah, which means putting back food onto the fire after it has been removed from the fire. The halacha is, like we said last time, that there are conditions. You can't just put it back. For example, we said that one of the rules is that it has to be, first of all, that the item, if we're talking about a cooked food, is yad soledet bo. It's, let's say, a dish of, cholent or whatever it is. Once it cools off to beneath yad soledet bo, then to put it back on would be to reheat it, at least according to us. Sephardic custom is that would be considered cooking. You can't do that on Shabbat. So therefore, we would say that it has to be iyad soledet bo if you want to return to the fire. And of course, we also mentioned in the past that returning it to the fire is forbidden if the fire is revealed, or if the heating element is revealed. It has to be covered. It has to be. The term was garuf v'katum. It has to be that the heating element, in the case of coals, was covered with ashes. We said that was a sign that the person was mesiach dat from the item, which means that he is saying that I'm not trying to come back and stir up the coals anymore. Look, I have ashes on top of them, so it's not a concern for me. And it's a reminder as well not to stir up the coals. So we said over here too, it must be garuf v'katum. If you want to put something back onto a fire, then it has to be covered. The fire must be covered. That would make it what we would call katum. The fire is covered with ashes in the times of the Mishnah. Here we take a sheet of metal and we put it on top of the fire, and that makes it covered. Or in the case of a hot plate, we said the hot plate is also considered to be garuf v'katum, being that it's just one setting. I guess that would make a difference if it was a hot plate that you could have a knob that gives it multiple settings, so that knob maybe should be covered before Shabbat. But if it's just a standard hot plate, which is just you plug it in and it's one setting, then there's really not much that can be done. You can't really cook on that. So we said that would also have the status of garuf v'katum, and you can put things back onto that. So remember, there are four main conditions for Chazarah. Number one, we said it has to be yad soledet bo. Number two, it has to be garuf v'katum, right? Okay. So far, so good, right? Okay. We also said that you may not put it down on the floor, right? You may not put it down on the floor. If you put it down on the floor, that shows that you were mesiach da'at from the cooking, and that is a big problem. Meaning not cooking, from the fact that it was previously on the fire. And now it's like putting it on a new time, right? So that's a big problem, right? And obviously, last but not least, it has to be fully cooked. Even if it was totally, totally hot, but it wasn't fully cooked, and you putting it back on would continue cooking it. There's no question that would be forbidden, because this is an act of cooking. That was the general thing that we said when it comes to putting something back onto a regular fire. That is in terms of a hot plate, in terms of a blech. What about when it's an oven? So we said by an oven there are added conditions. you have to remove the knobs or cover them with something so that you don't touch the knobs. We said that. Like we said, it has to be fully cooked. If it's liquidy, it has to be yad soledet bo, like we said, 111, 113 degrees, or 111, a little bit more lenient. It has to be hot, right? And the added thing here is that often enough, the person will have other foods that are still in the oven. Now, the added concern is that if you open the oven up and you take out what you want, and then you go ahead and serve, let's say, from that dish or whatever was in the oven, put it back and then close the oven again. If the oven is still on and the food inside is not totally cooked, now you're cooking, right? So that's important. The only way that you would be allowed to close that oven door is if whatever is inside is fully cooked, so that you don't cook the other foods. And then we also said, again, the same idea, you cannot put that item on the floor. Remember, we learned about countertops. We said that putting it on a countertop is also an issue, according to many, and that's also like putting it on the floor. We did say, though, however, if you put a towel on the counter first, and then put the pot or whatever it is, the serving thing, on the counter, then that's not considered putting it on the floor, and therefore you would be allowed to still put it back. All this is familiar to everyone? Just recapping, we're good? Excellent. Okay, very good. Now, we also mentioned by an oven that for an oven, if the fire is still on, then this is where Shabbat mode is effective. Contrary to popular opinion, unfortunately. I don't know why they call it Shabbat mode. A lot of people think that you can put food into the oven on Shabbat while the fire is on for the first time. Like take food out of your fridge, put it into the oven on Shabbat while the fire is on. That is not the purpose of Shabbat mode. Shabbat mode is to prevent the turning on of the fire by opening up the door of the oven. That's the main purpose, okay? Or to prevent the increase of the flame, that it should now become a stronger fire and become bigger because cold air went in. The Shabbat mode prevents that from happening. Shabbat mode means that the fire will be on constantly and it will not change its setting. So by you opening the door, nothing will happen. Now, why are we so scared over here? We asked the question last week, what's the great scare by an oven as opposed to a refrigerator, a water cooler, where we might be much more lenient and we might say that, hey, you're not sitting there listening to the refrigerator to wait till it turns on, which, by the way, some people do. Some people do sit and wait by the fridge to hear when it turns on, or by the water cooler to hear when the motor starts running. There are machmirim like that. But let's say for the people who are not machmir, so what happened by an oven? All of a sudden we need a Shabbat mode. The answer is, over here we're talking about lighting a fire. Potentially your action could be lighting a fire, which is much more severe than a typical rabbinical prohibition, and that's why this Shabbat mode is very important. So to go ahead and open it up and then risk turning on the fire, that's a serious thing. So therefore the Shabbat mode needs to be there. Or you could have an indicator light that shows you that the fire is presently on. Then once it's on, you open it up and you put it in. Not put it in, you take it out. And then if you want to put it back in and you have the right conditions like we've been talking about, then you'd be allowed to. Is it good? So far, so good? Did we talk about all of this last time? Every single thing. Okay, great. I just wanted to do Chazarah on that. I just wanted to make sure that we have it all clear. Fine. A couple of more points about this. If your soup is still, let's say, yad soledet bo, let's say, God forbid, there's a power outage, okay? Your soup is still yad soledet bo, it's still hot, it's still piping hot. The halacha is that you would be allowed, if there's an eruv and you're allowed to carry where you live, you would be allowed to carry it to your, let's say, neighbor's hot plate. The neighbor has electricity. That'd be fine, because you are allowed to you're allowed to move from one hot plate to another. The poskim talk about that. Or you could, according to many as well, you could even move it from one side of the hot plate to the other side of the hot plate, or one side of the fire to the other side of the fire. Again, provided that it's already at the heat of Yad Soledet Bo. So then there's no, the fact that you're putting it closer to the fire underneath it is not problematic according to most authorities. So again, if let's say there's a power outage, you want to take it to your neighbor, so the poskim are lenient. They say you could, again, provided that it's in a place that you could carry, and also it has to be that it didn't go below Yad Soledet Bo, so you would be allowed to still keep it on the hot plate. Okay, fine, very good. Let's continue. All right, so now we get to another very important subject in the laws of cooking. This is the subject called Hatmanah. Hatmanah means insulation. Chazal wanted us to eat hot food on Shabbat. Very interesting thing about having hot food on Shabbat. It used to be much harder to have hot food on Shabbat, but thank goodness now we have it a little bit easier. But there was a very important reason for that, because it says that we know the Torah tells us that you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbat. Lo tevaru esh b'chol moshavotechem b'yom Shabbat. You can't light a fire on Shabbat. So this group of unfortunately Jews who denied the existence and the authenticity of the oral Torah, they interpreted this line of the Torah, which says don't light a fire on Shabbat, to mean that you cannot have a fire, even if it was lit before Shabbat, lit in your house on Shabbat. So according to their view, it's impossible to have any hot food on Shabbat day, because the only way to have hot food on Shabbat day is if there was still a fire that was going, or something that was maintaining the heat. So in their view, it was a really almost impossible thing to happen. So in order for us to show that we do not hold like them, that we believe that lighting a fire on Shabbat means literally on Shabbat, but if it was before Shabbat, then there's absolutely no problem whatsoever to have the fire lit before Shabbat. So the rabbis said it's a big mitzvah on Shabbat day to eat something that is hot. That's the big custom almost in all sects, not sects, but in all areas of the world. Jews on Shabbat afternoon have something hot. Either it's cholent, or Moroccans have schena, or I don't know, different types of stews maybe. All kinds of hot food on Shabbat, and it's a big mitzvah. The poskim say, Rabbi Zerachia Halevi has a line. He says that if a person doesn't eat hot food on Shabbat, we have to investigate. Maybe he's a heretic. Maybe he's somebody who denies the oral Torah. It's a very, very big mitzvah to eat. And he says, so he writes a little poem about this. He says, Tzarich le'azmin, you have to set aside ahead of time. Levashel, you have to cook le'atmin, to insulate. And why insulate? Because insulating is going to keep the food hot. Le'aneg et Shabbat ule'ashmin, make the Shabbat pleasurable and make yourself get fat from Shabbat. And by doing that, that way you'll merit to have to see the end of time with Mashiach Tzidkenu. Amazing. By eating your cholent on Shabbat, little did you know that you are going to see Mashiach Tzidkenu. That's the blessing of the Baal HaMaor ben Uzrachi Halevi. It's a big deal. So, and by the way, that's why the Gemara tells us, because it was hard to have, and people, didn't really have that much ability to have that. So the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat says that chamin b'motzei Shabbat melugma, that to have hot water after Shabbat is therapeutic, very good, because on Shabbat it was not the easiest thing to stay warm like that. But motzei Shabbat you can heat it up again, and therefore you'll have hot water motzei Shabbat. Chamin is the modern Hebrew term for cholent. But in the Mishnah, chamin just means hot water. Still, the point is that there should be hot water, something hot on Shabbat. So now the way that it was done is like this. They used to have this method called insulation, which means that you would take your pot of hot food, and while it was still hot, you would stuff it. You would take all kinds of different things and wrap those items around your pot directly. It could be, the Gemara talks about all kinds of things, cotton balls that were placed inside of a box, and the pot was inside the cotton balls, inside of the box that was closed. And then they wrapped other things around it, and they insulate it. They do whatever they can to maintain the heat of that item. That was a very common thing. So the Gemara gives us one very important rule of thumb. The Gemara says that there's a difference between before Shabbat, insulation that's done before Shabbat, and insulation that's done on Shabbat. As a rule of thumb, insulating food is 100% forbidden to do on Shabbat, period. It doesn't matter with what. Okay? Now, shortly, we're going to explain what are the different types of insulation that are out there. But as a rule of thumb, on Shabbat, it's forbidden to insulate. Now, shortly, we're going to explain why. But before Shabbat, it is forbidden to insulate things only with something that adds heat. There are certain types of material that add heat. For example, the Gemara says that salt adds heat, sand adds heat. Different types of parts of olives, the junk of olives adds heat. Sesame adds heat. Now, why does it add heat? It's a tough question for us to understand nowadays. It seems like there's some kind of a concept scientifically. I remember once asking my Rabbi Belsky about this. I believe that his answer was by the olives that there's combustion. There's a certain type of combustion that takes place by these types of things, and they add heat to the item that is being insulated. Then there are types of things that, so these are things that add heat. Salt adds heat, sand adds heat, this olive type of thing adds heat, sesame adds heat. More commonly nowadays, I'll give you the simplest example. Let's say you ever see those electric heating blankets? You know, that's something which adds heat, right? So these are things that add heat. Now there are things which are einam mosifim hevel. They don't add heat. For example, a regular blanket, clothing, towels, those things do not add heat. So the idea is like this. Before Shabbat, you cannot insulate with something that adds heat, but you can insulate with something that does not add heat. Now, what is the reason for this? What is the reason for these rules? Again, it never says anywhere in the Torah that you cannot insulate something before Shabbat if it adds heat. It's just a rabbinic rule. The question is, why did they make this rule? So the answer is that a lot of times they used to insulate with hot ashes. The ashes were ashes that were on top of coals. And the reason they insulated in hot ashes is because the item was already hot. But if you have just even the ashes of these coals that are surrounding your pot, it'll keep the heat very nice and strong, even add a little bit of heat. So the problem is like this. What happens if a person comes Friday night back to the house and he goes and he sees the soup is just not as hot as he would like it to be? Sometimes if the food isn't as hot as you want, so it just doesn't taste as good. It's that you almost have no desire for it anymore. So the person naturally says, this is not what I want. So they'll go and they'll mess with the ashes that are underneath. The ashes were on coals and the coals were on fire. So if that's the case, then you just involved yourself in the melacha called lighting a fire on Shabbat. So you just lit a fire by stirring those coals up. So for that reason, because of the fact that they used to insulate with hot ashes which had coals under them, so therefore the rabbis prohibited insulation before Shabbat with anything that has an additional heat source, meaning it's adding more heat to the pot that's being insulated. Is it clear so far? 100%? Okay, great. So now the story is like this. If it adds heat, it's forbidden even before Shabbat. If it does not add heat, then it's okay before Shabbat, but it's prohibited on Shabbat. The most practical example I could think of is if, let's say, a person unfortunately has a power outage in his house on Shabbat. Hot plate is now off. Soup is piping hot. Cholent is piping hot. But the men are coming home from shul in about a half an hour, 45 minutes. You don't want to schlep to the neighbor, put it on their hot plate. Take the thing off, take a few blankets, wrap it up, and insulate it. Very good. Says the halacha, can't do that. On Shabbat, it is prohibited to insulate. Okay? So you cannot insulate, you cannot even throw things that do not add heat. Let's say a regular blanket, a regular towel, piece of clothing. You cannot insulate that hot pot of soup on Shabbat. Okay, that is the Gzerah of Hatmanah on Shabbat. And the chidush is that before Shabbat, even though it's being done prior to Shabbat, if the insulating item is adding heat, like we said, that electronic blanket, which continues to add heat, that you cannot insulate with that, even though you did so before Shabbat. So far, so good? Yes, question.
There's this like Shabbat cover thing that you put on top of like food. I don't know what it's called.
The blanket.
It's like a blanket, yeah. That you put on top of food with like on top of like a hot plate or whatever. So I can't use that. I can't put that on for like lunch, but I can put it on before Shabbat.
I'm sorry, one more time.
I don't know what it's called.
It's a blanket.
It's a blanket.
Again, one more time.
Yeah, it's kind of like a quilt. I don't know. It's something that's like for Shabbat that you put on top of the food when the food's on the hot plate. It's like, I guess, I don't know.
Sorry, sorry, one more time. You have a blanket, you want to put it on top of food on Shabbat?
A lot of people do that, like they throw food in.
Very good. Regular standard blanket that you want to put on top, or one of those Shabbat covers
Those Shabbat covers,
to the stuff on your hot plate?
yeah.
Okay, let's leave that for a minute. Very good.
Okay.
Excellent. We're gonna get there. Clear so far, so good? Beautiful. What?
Something different.
That is
It's something different.
that is absolutely what we're gonna talk about very shortly. 100%. It's not something different at all. That's very much so what we are going to talk about. Okay, so now let's take a look over here. Okay, but before we get to that, I want to just give you a couple of important points about insulation. Okay. The first point is like this. It's only considered hatmanah. The first rule is it's only considered hatmanah if the insulator is directly on the item itself. Okay, so this is exactly what you're talking about, and we're going to talk about why this is relevant. Okay, so if let's say you have something which is giving heat, but it is not directly on the pot. It may surround the pot, but it's not directly touching the pot. So then that would not be a problem of insulation. Okay, the insulation that we're talking about is always when it's directly surrounding the pot. Okay, so that's step one. So what would be an example of this? We just mentioned before the idea that if you have all the right conditions there, then the halacha says that you're allowed to put something even back into an oven, right? Well, 1 second. We just got finished saying that even before Shabbat, if you have something which adds heat, you cannot insulate in such an item, right? So then how could you ever put something back into an oven that's adding heat? That's definitely something which will keep your food hot and it's going to add heat. How is that okay? The answer is because the oven doesn't directly touch your pot. It's bigger than your pot, okay? It contains your pot, but it does not directly drape and fall over the pot.
So if you leave your oven on,
Okay, so we just spoke about the conditions of Chazarah for an oven. I'll just say them briefly. That's okay. So number one, you have to make sure the knobs are removed. Number two, the food must be fully cooked. Number 3, if it's liquidy, then it still has to be very hot yad soledet bo. Number 4, whatever was left in the oven that you are opening up and now closing, if you have other dishes that you are serving in the oven, so they have to be fully cooked, because if you close the door, then you're going to cook them. That's bad. So they has to be fully cooked. And number 5, you can't put the item that you are removing on the floor or on the counter unless you put a towel first. Number 6, either you have Shabbat mode, so that the fire doesn't turn on when you open the door of the oven, or you have an indicator light that tells you the fire is already on, and only then you open up the door. By the way, one more point about that. You cannot put back into the oven baked goods. For example, I didn't say this before, I'm glad I repeated these rules. You cannot put into the oven, let's say a challah. You want to put a challah into the oven to reheat. Can't do that. There's a rule called mechazi kemevashel, which means it looks like cooking. In this case, it looks like baking, right? When you put a challah into the oven, you're going to end up taking the challah out of the oven, which means it looks like you just baked a challah. But that's a separate rabbinic rule, which the rabbis said you cannot do something which looks like you baked. So if it's a baked good, you cannot take that out of an oven. You could put it on a hot plate, because a hot plate, nobody bakes on a hot plate. But in an oven where people bake, you cannot put a challah into the oven to bake, or a boreka, or something that people would bake in an oven, a baked product. So that would be an issue. So that's a good rule to remember. Okay.
What if it's baked already?
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm not taking questions from Zoom. I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay, because I don't know how you're on my Zoom right now. Okay, what?
Hashem wants me to be in this class.
Okay, I got you. I'm sorry, I'm not taking questions from Zoom. Sorry. Okay. Now,
Wait, sorry.
yeah,
Can you just repeat what you said about the breaker? So if you bake the breaker in the oven, you're saying it's not something we should warm up in an oven?
don't put a boreka in, even if you have all these conditions, because it looks like you baked it. When you take it out.
Even though it was
Yes,
before.
yes,
What if
yes.
it was like in an aluminum and like covered, and no one can
I
see
don't
it?
think you should do it.
No.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you leave it in there before Shabbat and take it out on Shabbat? Or just?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
That looks like we just based it on Shabbat.
But no, because it was there from before Shabbat. So if you had baked it before, it's fine. See what I'm saying? Had you put it in before, that'd be okay.
But things that could be baked also on the stove, but people put in the oven, then it's okay.
What?
If it's like a meatball, for example, some people cook it on a stove top, some people in an oven, but you could still put that in the oven because it's
I
not.
believe so. It's not a baked product. It's not like it's a meatball.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Fine. Good. So we said it has to, of course, be something which is fully cooked. Excellent. So now let's get to the nitty-gritty. So the big question that everybody grapples with over here is the question that you had asked before. That is like the big question over here. The reason for this being the big question is because how do we get away with that? Is that at all something we can get away with? Again, think about it. If there is a heat source on the bottom, constantly adding heat to whatever it is that you have over there, and then you literally top it off with this blanket or whatever it is. So why is that not considered to be insulation with something that's adding more heat? So to be quite honest, many people hold that it is. And therefore they hold that that's a problem. You cannot cover something while it is on top. Now, to be honest with you, this is a very interesting thing. The Ramah is lenient. The Ramah over here holds. The Ramah is the head of all the Ashkenazi poskim. And the Ramah says, as long as your cover does not drape down, meaning does not completely cover everything, so then that is an acceptable type of insulation. It's not called insulating on Shabbat. Now, the Shulchan Aruch was super duper strict we Sfaradim usually follow the Shulchan Aruch. And he was super duper strict. And he said, not only is that not true, but even if you cover from just one side, that will already present a problem of insulation. Right? So that is the very big argument over here. Between the Rama and the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch held Hatmanah b'miktzat is a problem, right? Now, being that that is the debate, so that makes things even worse for us. So now, not only is it covering on one side, according to the Shulchan Aruch, but it's also got the heat source on the bottom, which makes it very, very difficult for us. So, how do we get out of this issue? So the poskim say something very interesting. The poskim say that the Shulchan Aruch, which is what we follow, gave a little opening for a leniency over here, and in other places where this kind of thing would happen. The Shulchan Aruch said, look, I'm writing this book now called Shulchan Aruch, and I'm explaining to you what makes sense to me. He says, but if you have a custom that predates me, so he says, you're entitled to follow your custom. He says, I'm not going to make you stop doing what you've been doing in your community for centuries. So over here, many say that there was the opinion of one of the very, very early Rishonim. His name was the Ramban, Nachmanides. He was a great, great, great tzaddik. And his opinion over here was something interesting. We can look at the two components over here as separate from one another, which means that we can say the fire on the bottom is not related to the covering on top, which means that I don't have insulation with an object that's adding heat. In other words, like we said, what's called insulation with an object that's adding heat? That would be insulating with sand, with salt, with the refuse of the olives. These types of materials are insulation with you're surrounding the pot with these types of materials that add heat. Okay, fine. However, over here, there's a cover on top, there's a heat source on the bottom, but one does not connect with the other. That was the view of the Ramban. And the poskim say that it seems that many Sephardic communities already had a custom to hold like this Ramban. So the reason that they permit covering the food before Shabbat with one of these big blankets or Shabbat covers over the hot plate or over the Blech is because of the minhag, the custom that followed this Ramban, predating the time of Shulchan Aruch. It's very rare that such a thing should happen. We usually always follow the Shulchan Aruch. And to be honest with you, a lot of the regular Talmidei Chachamim that you'll listen to, you hear the shiurim, they'll say, look, we always follow Shulchan Aruch. That's what we should do here too. So it's very wrong of us to all of a sudden say that you can do this when Shulchan Aruch says you can't do this. We always follow Shulchan Aruch. But if you look in the Yalkut Yosef, if you look in Chacham Ovadiah's writings, he says it's true we always follow Shulchan Aruch, but the Shulchan Aruch himself says that if there's ever a custom that predates him, we could be lenient, and therefore we can be lenient in this area as well. Just read it to you inside. I have a beautiful piece here from here. I'll just read to you what he says. This is from the Sefer Or HaHalacha. I'll read to you his words inside. He says like this: Minhag ze na'agu Yisrael kedat hacholkim haRamban v'siyato. He says this custom comes from the Ramban and those who agreed with him. And he says, Shekol she'akdera lo nogaat bagechalim. So long as the pot does not touch the coals, in this case, the flame underneath, okay? Anu danim kol davar leatzmo. We view each thing on its own. Klomar, hanachat hasir al gabei ha'esh me'erev Shabbat muteret. We look at everything individually. First question, you're putting a pot on a fire from before Shabbat. Is that acceptable? The answer is, like we learned in the past, yes, it's acceptable, right? Depending on how cooked it is, right? We said ideally it should be fully cooked, or it could be totally raw. According to the more lenient opinion, we said even if it's just half cooked, it's okay. So is that okay to leave the pot on the fire? Yes, it was okay. Now, and we also hold, according to this custom of the Ramban, that you're allowed to separately cover a pot before Shabbat with articles of clothing. Even though this goes against the decision that was made by the Shulchan Aruch. Even though Shulchan Aruch says, hey, this is the worst kind of insulation. You're insulating with a heat source on the bottom, and we said that you can't even do that before Shabbat. He says, even though that's true, but says the Bet Yosef, shekol shekadam haminhag lidvarav hayikar kaminhag. The Bet Yosef himself wrote that if the minhag, the custom, preceded his decision, then we follow the custom. And therefore, the custom is to be lenient, and that's why it's okay. So, for that reason, the poskim allow that to be done. Clear? Okay, yes.
Sorry, I'm a little confused. I
Sure.
thought we're not allowed to put the blanket on Shabbat. You only put it on
Before Shabbat, correct.
So why would it even be an issue if you're allowed to put it on before Shabbat if it's not like a conducting?
Because the question is, do we combine the fact that the blanket is on before Shabbat on top of, let's say, a heat-adding source like a hot plate? Or, see what I'm saying? In other words, the problem here is, if I would ask you, what is going to add more heat? Like a hot plate underneath, or salt that you would surround your, you see what I'm saying? That's the problem over here. The salt is like, oh no, he's gonna put his pot in salt. It's gonna be really bad. His salt is really bad, but like I'm allowed to leave my hot plate on top of, the pot on top of a hot plate with a cover on top. It's like it's gonna be really hot. So what he's explaining is that we view each thing separately. So what that means is that you have to ask two questions. Am I allowed to leave a pot on top of a hot plate? Yes. Am I allowed to, before Shabbat, take a hot pot and insulate it with blankets? Yes. So it's separate. It's two separate things. Again, is this what Shulchan Aruch says? No. Shulchan Aruch says this is not okay. But apparently there was a custom that predated the Shulchan Aruch, which permitted this. Yeah.
So the Shabbat cover that you're talking about can only be put on for Shabbat?
Correct.
Okay.
That must be done before Shabbat 100%. Yes. This was this is the opinion of Chacham Ovadia, and I'm quoting right now a sefer called Or HaHalacha, which is also explaining the same thing. What? No, it's a different rabbi's book that he's quoting Rabbi Ovadia and explaining him. There's more to it, but that's the idea. But yes, indeed, the point is that that it needs to be done. We're talking about where it's being done before Shabbat. Correct. Now, yes.
So let's say you have a crock pot that you didn't put like
Ooh, good question. Crock pots. Yes.
So can you, let's say you wanted to take like an egg out of the challah ahead of time, you can't like put the pot, take an egg out while it's on like it's in the crock pot.
So let's talk about crock pots for a great question. So crock pots are a very big question for this reason. Because the crock pot, the way it works is you have the actual pot itself, and then it goes right into the heating element. So many want to say that as well is a problem of insulation on Shabbat. So this is another reason why it is beneficial, like we learned, I believe, either last time, 2 shurim ago, we learned about the concept of putting aluminum foil or tin foil inside of the insert. We learned that that is enough to make it garuf the katum, which means that if you take it out, you'd be allowed to put it back in. But now there's an added benefit that it's not hatmanah either, because it's elevating the pot a little bit outside of the heating element. Follow what I'm saying? So now it's not hatmanah because it's not, remember we learned that an oven is not gonna be hatmanah because it's not directly touching the pot that's inside of it. This also is now elevated from the heating element, so it's not touching it directly. The foil, yeah.
If you take the lid off and take food out, putting the lid back on is not done. Because the lid touches back to it.
The lid is not insulation. It's insulating around the lid.
Also,
You understand? The lid is the part and parcel of the pot itself. See what I'm saying?
But if the lid has a bounty under it or a towel under it, people put, they line the lid with something to add moisture. I've seen, and so then they
Okay.
wouldn't be able to take out like an egg.
They would, why not? The lid is part of the pot. The lid is not insulation.
So even though it has the towel under the pot and when.
Where's the towel? It's underneath the lid in the pot, in the cholent?
Like it's not in the cholent, it's not going in, but they line
The lid with
lid.
something like that? Interesting. As far as I know, insulation means that you are covering the pot itself, which includes the lid.
Okay.
So as long as you're not doing that, then you're okay. Okay, yes,
I just want to clarify.
okay,
just a little confused.
Okay.
So, insulating heat is a problem if it's on a hot plate and on Shabbat, you want to put a towel on top. But there's no problem if the pot is off the heating source and you want to wrap it in a towel. That's not a problem.
when?
When it's off the hot plate,
On Shabbat, you can't do that.
even with the towel that isn't provided.
Correct. On
So,
Shabbat,
I
you,
understand how it was said in the beginning, how the Gemara says that you can't insulate with something that gives off heat
before Shabbat,
before Shabbat.
Right.
Oh, so all of this is, everything that's mutar has to be done before Shabbat,
correct,
not on Shabbat.
correct.
Okay.
On Shabbat, you would not be allowed to take a pot of soup and wrap it in a blanket. As I was trying to say, if let's say there's a power outage and now there's a half an hour till everyone comes home, and you say to yourself, let me just try and maintain the heat by wrapping it up and putting it inside of a box or something until everyone comes home. Can't do that on Shabbat. See what I'm saying?
Right.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't remember which one this is, but he said that you can't, like, let's say you put like a aluminum pan on the Blech. You can't then take like a sheet of aluminum foil and cover the pan. It has to be like covered specifically.
Yeah, one more time. Sorry, let's get it one more
If you
time.
put it on the Blech,
If I put something on the Blech,
it has to be covered with the right lid for the pot. You can't just use the random. You can't take like a sheet of foil and cover the pot. Is that
yeah, I have a pot, let's say of what? What am I putting on? Meaning before, we're talking before Shabbat? On Shabbat, what am I putting on the hot plate? Okay, so we're talking, let's say chicken?
Right.
Okay, pot of chicken,
It
cold
doesn't-
chicken,
Yeah,
dry chicken.
sure.
Okay,
Doesn't have like the right lid or something.
okay.
You can't cover it with random, it can't be completely covered, basically what you're saying.
You cannot completely cover it.
Yeah.
Okay, so, right, so that would be, yeah, because you're insulating.
But if the pot has a lid. you understand?
No, the lid. In other words, you're covering the lid. In other words, you're,
You're creating. Covering the item.
Yeah.
Covering the chicken.
okay, so in this particular case, you're saying that there is no lid.
He's saying like you can't completely cover the food. Even with the lid.
Oh, even with the lid.
Like leave it a little bit off.
Okay, I don't know.
Is that-
I don't know.
it is-
Get me the Give me the source. Give me the source. I don't know. It could be. I don't know. I haven't heard. I don't. As far as I know, it's okay, but I don't think that's called insulating. It's just. Yeah, I don't think that's called insulating. Is when you wrap up
So
something.
if I, because I remember. like, Oscar, then they cover it out. They don't cover it.
So no, Ashkenazim are more lenient over here. Interestingly enough.
I went to my friend and she was like, you can't cover it. I don't know what it is.
Meaning on Shabbat, you
On
can't,
Shabbat,
on Shabbat, you
you-
cannot, let's say, put a blanket on top and cover it completely. But if you would, let's say, leave it open a little bit, Ashkenazim would say it's okay.
That's what she was.
Yeah. When you, but that's talking about covering the whole pot. I don't think that refers to covering with the lid of the pot itself.
Okay, so
I might be
there's
off on
no
that.
issue, let's say I made baked chicken in the oven, it's completely dry. It's wrapped in foil. Like, wrapped. No problem with it.
I don't think so. As far as I know, yeah.
So if I use glass, those glass baking dishes, I put my dried chicken in there. I can't put that plastic lid on the plaza.
Again, I don't, no, that's not insulating. The lid of the item itself, as far as I know, is not called insulating. Insulating is putting something on top of the lid. It's a blanket
So
on
like
top of the
wrapping
lid.
challah that wasn't wrapped before Shabbat, like I cover my challah in foil and then I warm it up on the plaza that way. So if I didn't wrap it for some reason, I can't wrap it in tin foil and then put it on the plaza on Shabbat.
Wrapping the challah in tin. You want to wrap the thing completely
Yeah. All-
and then put it on the.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a little bit different because there is no vessel. There, that's directly on the food itself. So that might be a little bit different. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like to take the item, completely wrap it like that, that would be something else. Meaning we're talking so far about wrapping the vessel, right? And around the vessel, that would be an issue. Here, we're saying it's not about the vessel, it's the actual food item itself. So that would probably be more of an issue. You see what I'm saying? As
So that's
far
an
as I know.
issue?
What?
That's an issue for wrap challah and put it on the hot plate.
Very likely, yeah.
So what would you? How can
Leave
you
it
put
open,
challah?
leave it open.
Not even to put it on top of tin foil,
You put it on top of tinfoil,
don't wrap it.
don't like totally wrap it. Yeah,
What if it's left open on the top, just the side of the wrap?
so there are those that are very lenient. The Ashkenazim would be very lenient over here. I believe that there's, as far as I know, there's room to be lenient as well for us too. Okay. I wanted to just talk about a few other points over here, which are important to be aware of. Hatmanah is only a problem with the Kli Rishon. If you remove the contents of the Kli Rishon into a different container, let's say you take all of the cholent out of the crock pot, and then you put it into a soup tureen. You know the soup tureens? No? Soup tureen is a big bowl. It's like China, and it has a lid, and you put everything inside. Let's say it's soup. You put all the soup inside of it, cover it up with the lid. There's a little spot for the spoon, the ladle to come out of. No soup tureens? No. Right? What? A cauldron? Is that okay? Fine. So then now you could insulate it. Okay, why? Because it's not in the Kli Rishon. The Kli Sheni, you could insulate. Okay, so that's important to be aware of. That might be a suggestion. Somebody might say, well, I can't do the Kli Rishon, but I moved it to a Kli Sheni, I'm okay. There are those that are lenient to say, yeah, I'm sorry.
That's right. So I don't get why challah is a problem if it's not like already warm. I don't know if I'm mixing this up, but like if we were talking about hot objects and if we move it already to a pisheni, it's not an issue. Why the cold challah being wrapped a problem? It doesn't have like a
No,
heat.
cold holiday wrap is definitely not a problem. The
So
problem was when you're putting it on the heat source.
yeah, wrapping it and then putting it on the heat source, like
Yeah, because we're not allowed to, remember, the whole idea of insulation, the heter that we had was for somebody before Shabbat to have a blanket over the food. And we said we look at it as two separate things. Can I wrap something in blankets before Shabbat? Yes. Can I have food on the fire before Shabbat? Yes. Okay. That's the big leniency, right? But on Shabbat, can I wrap something in up completely?
What if it's cold?
If it's cold, it's fine. It's something else. But over here, it's not just cold. You're putting it on the fire.
It's cold before you put it.
You're right, but you're, in other words, when you, the whole heter that we had was to do that before Shabbat.
But then
We look at it separately before Shabbat. We don't do that on Shabbat. So if you're wrapping it up and there's a heat source on Shabbat already, that, from what I understand, is already an issue.
But then if we're moving it to a cliche, we're removing it from the heat, like making it colder, and now you can insulate it?
Correct. Because now you lost the whole strength of the Kli Rishon. The Kli Rishon always adds heat. That's the advantage of Kli Rishon. The walls are adding heat.
But then even this
Right?
food in a cliche would still be hotter than this challah that's never touched heat that you didn't wrap.
Yeah, the problem is that it's going to have heat added to it and it's going to maintain it because it's wrapped. So,
but
and
wouldn't
that
the
you cannot do on
cliche
Shabbat.
also-
What?
Wouldn't the cliche also?
No. The Kli Sheni, you have removed the initial heat from the Kli Rishon. There's not going to be additional heat being added. And now you're insulating a Kli Sheni
Oh, you're doing it off the fire.
off the fire.
That's why I
Yeah,
got confused. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
yeah.
Okay, thank
The
you.
wrapped challah, can I put it on top of like a lid of a pot that's on the hot plate? Not directly on the hot plate, but it's wrapped,
Totally wrapped.
totally wrapped.
I don't think so.
I just.
I
I'm so
know,
shocked
I
at
know.
this every single week.
I'm sorry. If it's totally wrapped, I mean, the whole heter is when it's, I mean, even the lenient Ashkenazi approach, it requires that some of it should be open. To totally wrap it while there's heat underneath, as far as I know, you can't do that, yeah.
Even if you wrapped it for Shabbat.
No, so if you wrapped it before Shabbat, so then you have this lenient, again, according to Shulchan Aruch, yes, that's forbidden completely, but if you're going with the more lenient approach that was a custom before Shulchan Aruch, so then as long as it was done before Shabbat,
But even if like you don't put it on the heat until it's a Shabbat day, if you wrapped it for Shabbat.
no, then they wrapped it and put it on the, yeah, wrapped it and put it on the hot plate before Shabbat, okay.
Yeah, everyone does that. I would have never known if it wasn't.
As far as I know, that's the issue. I'll definitely reach out and double check, but as far as I know, that's the issue. Okay. So again, if it's in a Kli Sheni, there's no problem. Are you allowed to use a thermos on Shabbat? So many poskim hold that using a thermos is fine. It's not considered an act of Hatmanah, because you're pouring it out of the first initial vessel. So let's say you want to pour hot water from your urn to a thermos. Okay, there you go. It's not the original vessel that was on the fire, so therefore, it's not a problem of Hatmanah. Okay. It's not a problem of Hatmanah if your intention is for non-insulation purposes. For example, let's say I take 2 hot challahs off of the fire, 2 hot challahs out of the oven. I put it on the challah board and then I put a cover on top of it. All sides. It's all covered, completely covered. Is that insulation? So the answer is no, because I'm not trying to insulate. I'm just trying to cover the challahs to get it ready for Kiddush. If let's say I'm covering something that's hot on Shabbat because I don't want it to get dirty. Sometimes there's something dirty around, it's gonna spill onto the food, it's gonna, whatever it may be, and I'm covering something hot. Is that okay? The answer is yes, because my intention is not to insulate, my intention is to protect it from getting dirty. Okay, good. There's a discussion that comes up about what happens. I believe we spoke about this in the past, but it's important to review. What happens if a person has a baby bottle and you want to heat up the milk in the baby bottle? Sometimes there was maybe milk from the freezer that you put into the baby bottle. or whatever. Point is, you want to heat it up somehow. So the simple idea is, many times you could just take water from the urn, put it into the big bowl or big maybe cup, and you go ahead and you put the bottle in the hot water. So the bottle with the freezing cold milk is going to be inside of the huge bowl of hot water inside. Now, that would be that. Is that a problem of bishul? No. Why? Because we're talking about hot water in a kli sheni, and the kli sheni and mevashel doesn't cook. Okay, great. But the question is like this: what if I want to submerge the bottle in the hot water? Is that okay? So over here you have different opinions. The Taz and many poskim after him held like him that you may not submerge the bottle in the hot water, because that would be like insulating that bottle in the hot water. It's getting that heat that's totally submerged. So therefore that would be a problem. There were those that were lenient and they actually disagreed with the Taz. They said it's okay. But being that it's not so difficult to be machmir like him, it's better to simply keep the bottle somewhat, I guess, protruding, sticking out of the water a little bit, just the tip of it, and that way it's not totally submerged, and therefore it's not hatmanah even in his view. Okay, so that's a nice way to be machmir, like the Taz, if possible. Okay. Another question that comes up is, what happens if a person has something that they want to keep in the chalent? For example, this past Shabbat, actually, we had it. It was potato kugel that's cooked in the chalent. You ever see that? Yeah. It's an interesting thing. So it comes out tasting a little bit differently. So the question is that something which is okay, or is that hatmanah? It's hatmanah and something where there's constant heating. So, or by the way, there are other types of things like that. For example, kishke. You guys are on kishke, right? Kishke in the chalent, or some people like to have a separate bag of rice. All kinds of things like that. A separate bag of chicken or whatever, they have these cooking bags. Is that considered hatmanah, being that it's submerged within the chalent or not? So to that, we say that it's not considered to be hatmanah. You're allowed to put the kugel, kishke, rice, chicken, whatever it is, in a separate either foil or plastic or something like that. It's not considered to be hatmanah because it's not there for insulation. It's there to cook. It's there to get cooked. And therefore it's not, it falls under that category of, I didn't put it in there for insulation, I put it there for a different reason, to get cooked, and therefore that's not considered to be a problem. So that's considered acceptable. Okay, I'm done. Okay, thank you very much. If we have any questions, yes.